Look, I've got to apologise for the birds in the wind. That's the way it is. But obviously everybody's mind revolves around pandemics these days. So I'm going to look at a pandemic that's been around for about 40 years and which seems to be getting worse. And that's the public outsourcing pandemic. That's right, the public outsourcing pandemic. What's the public outsourcing pandemic? Why is it as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than COVID-19? Because COVID-19 will come, it will go. There'll be a cure, there may be a vaccination, it may dissipate over time with herd immunity. But the public outsourcing pandemic, it's something that we have had to deal with for the last 40 years. Is an exceptionally important issue, especially in this country. Because what we've seen over the last 40 years during the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation revolution that has swept across Australia and the rest of the world is the sale of public assets at bargain basement prices, fire sales, to the corporate and private sector. So generations of Australians worked to create essential services which were run by the government on behalf of the public. Things like electricity, gas, telecommunications, a publicly owned bank, a publicly owned airline, publicly owned ports, publicly owned airports, and this is just a small list. And what we've seen over the last 40 years is these assets have been sold. It's a little bit like if I've got chickens and I live off the eggs. Why would I sell the chickens who are producing eggs? Why would I bother if I haven't got other chickens ready to take their place? And that's what we've done. We've sold the family silver. We have sold our birthright. We have sold the work which is done by generations of Australians to raise the assets through public taxation in order to create these public institutions which provide essential services. About the only one that's left is a semi-privatised public hospital sector and a semi-privatised Australia Post. Everything else has been privatised, including the very organisations which do research into vaccines and produce vaccines. So what was the benefit? What was the benefit of selling assets which were making profits, and these profits were going back into the Treasury or going back into expanding the services which were being created by these essential services? What was the benefit? Is it lower prices? Is it more control? And why could a government at the federal and state level sell assets which theoretically belong to the people? Well, unfortunately, all those assets which were built up over a century, like the Commonwealth Bank, telecom, the ports, the airports, Qantas, and the list goes on and on, they didn't belong to the people. They belonged to the government of the day. They belonged to the so-called representatives of the people. So any government at any particular time that found itself in a financial black hole could sell off pieces of the family silver until there was none left. This didn't mean that those services still needed to be provided, because these were essential services. It didn't mean that we didn't need telecommunications, that we didn't need airlines, that we didn't need ports, that we didn't need airports, that we didn't need a private health system, which was financed through Medibank Private, run by the public, for the benefit of the public. And the list goes on. We needed all these services. We continue to need these services, because during the 20th century, what happened is all those facilities and services which could not be provided by the private sector at a reasonable price were underwritten and owned by the government of the day. And that's what public assets were. So what's happened? We've now reached the pinnacle of the public outsourcing revolution. And you only have to look at what's happened in Victoria in the last 2 months regarding the shemozzle surrounding COVID-19, the shemozzle surrounding aged care and the Commonwealth Government's responsibility for aged care and the increasing number of deaths in the aged care sector. The shemozzle revolving contact tracing, because there's really no public health system. No public health system to talk of. And what we are seeing is the consequences of outsourcing. So what is outsourcing? Well, the government still needs to provide a service. So what it does, it contracts private corporations to provide that service. And those private corporations, understanding the government of the day needs these services, one, jacks up their prices, and we've seen this with the National Disability Support Scheme, where a lot of money is being creamed off by privately owned organisations which are supplying services and goods to people with major disabilities in this country. And we've seen people complain consistently about how when you outsource it to the private sector, one, you have very little recourse in terms of complaints. The complaint system usually goes nowhere. Two, the services are normally overpriced. And let's not forget, for every dollar the government gives, outsources to a private corporation or a private organisation to provide a public service, 40 cents goes in the administration costs and profits. And for a significant degree, what is happening in the aged care services is quite literally due to the outsourcing of aged care sector to the private sector, to the for-profit sector. Because capitalism, as we know, is about private investment for private profit. People go into businesses, they go into these businesses in order to make a profit. And if they've got a direct line to the Treasury, as we see with privatised childcare, as we see with privatised aged care, as we see with the privatised ports, as we see in Victoria, which I'm familiar with even the privatisation of the Titles Office, and the list goes on and on, the privatisation of public housing, what we see is a great deal of public money which is wasted, given away to the private sector to provide a second-rate service with no mechanism by which people can make serious complaints about the service and the goods they receive. This is what outsourcing is. Now, outsourcing is not just a public problem, it's also a private problem. Because what we see is private organisations, the same private organisation supposedly in an open tender scheme, getting contracts to provide services, to provide security around military bases, to provide security at Manus Island and Nauru, which has fallen off, everybody's radar because everybody's concerned about COVID-19 and we forget about the refugees still marooned on Nauru and Manus Island, and the list goes on and on. But we see billions of dollars which is given to these private corporations to provide services. You could put every refugee who's in Manus Island and Nauru, you could put every refugee in the best suite, in the best hotel in this country, and at the end of the year still have money left over if you compare it to the type of money which is going to these private corporations, who then outsource it to somebody else, who outsources to somebody else, who outsources to somebody else. So nobody's eventually responsible for anything. And that's why they literally get away with murder, as we see in the aged care sector, as we saw with hotel quarantine. Because nobody is ultimately responsible. Because all the government can do is set parameters. It does not have the power to determine what happens. And then we have the serious situation, which we have in Victoria with contact tracing, where the government of the day, because of the deluge of privatisation and outsourcing which has occurred in Victoria and many other parts of Australia over the last 40 years does not have the infrastructure, the public memory, the individuals to carry out public health programs. And they have to go to the private sector once again, who again asks for ridiculous amounts of money to provide services. We see the same problem in so-called public hospitals. Most public hospitals in Victoria, which again I'm familiar with, and many other parts of the country, of Australia, have got privatised radiology, privatised pathology service, privatised ward staff, privatised food, privatised cleaning. And many of the nursing personnel come from private corporations to fill holes. So it is a major issue. Privatisation and outsourcing is a pandemic. It is a pandemic which has swept this country, which has not served this country well. It has not served the people in this country well. It is a total, unmitigated disaster. And what's worse is nobody's talking about it. They mention it, but they don't talk about changing it. They don't talk about reintroducing public services in this country. They don't talk about reintroducing a government-owned financial sector, a bank, to provide real competition. Because the dilemma is, in any economy, you've got three types of economy. You've got a public economy, where the state owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. You have a private economy, where the private sector, the private investment for private profits, owns most of the infrastructure and provides most of the services. And then you have a mixed economy. Well, when the state is in fully control of every asset, there's no competition. There's no mechanism by which you can complain, and what you see is a fossilised, bureaucratised, self-seeking state, society. When the private sector dominates every aspect of our existence, as it does in Australia, what you see is a sector which is driven by the need to create profit. If you don't create profit, you go bankrupt. If you go bankrupt... So, what can we do? What can we do? It's all very well complaining, and social media, the government gilded ABC, the corporate-owned media, private conversations are full of people complaining. As I keep saying, we've got two tribes in Australia, and I'm not talking about the 220 plus sovereign nation states which existed in this country before colonisation began in 1788, but we have two tribes in the 21st century, two major tribes. The Gunner tribe, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, and the somebody should do something about that tribe. Somebody should do something about that tribe. And while we continue to belong to those tribes, while we continue to be cynical about the possibility of change, while we lose hope, and hope is the love child of desire and expectation, the desire for change and the expectation that change will occur, while we continue to complain amongst ourselves, while we continue to mumble in our beards, while we continue to have polite barbecue backyard conversations or angry backyard conversations over spring and summer as the COVID-19 crisis continues, the fact is that change doesn't come from complaining. Obviously, when people complain, it is an impetus for change. The problem is, we've become a nation of carping consumers, complaining constantly. We are not acting as concerned citizens and active citizens. Democracy is not about casting a ballot every 3 to 4 years to elect representatives to make decisions for you, who ultimately have minimal power. But democracy is about day-to-day participation in the decision-making processes. It's about being part and parcel been involved in many things in society, whether it's a group, whether it's a protest, whether it's a petition, whether it's belonging to a new political party, like public interest before corporate interests. I mean, ultimate political authority doesn't lie in the hands of the state, or the bureaucracy, or the corporate sector. Ultimate political power lies in the hands of the people, but not a quiet people. It lies in the hands of an active population which is continually involved in the debate, which continually puts pressure on people in authority to change the direction we're going in. And that pressure does not exist in Australia. Pre-COVID-19 it didn't exist, post-COVID-19 doesn't exist. The only pressure that we seem to have is single issue campaigns. It's about all that people think can occur as we can change issue after issue. But we need greater ideas. We need to be able to put ideas to the population, not just me talking to a few people once a week on social media. I mean, that achieves hardly anything, apart from, you know, being in the sunshine and listening to the birds. If you want change, you need to work for change. Well, if you don't want change, that's fine. If you're happy to be exploited, that's fine. If you're happy for all taxpayers' dollars to be outsourced, to provide a second-rate, privately managed public sector, well, that's fine. But if you want something different, well, you need to act differently. I mean, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing the same way and getting the same outcome. It's a little bit like being an activist and bashing your head against a brick wall. You don't have to bash your head against a brick wall. You can blow up the brick wall, you can dig under the brick wall, you can go round the brick wall, you can clamber over the brick wall. And that's what change is about. Change is about people taking risks. And if you're not a member of public interest before corporate interests, if you are interested in concepts like making the corporate sector pay, stopping outsourcing, stopping casualisation, having permanent work, creating collectives and cooperatives, signing a treaty or treaties with this country's First Nations people, introducing a universal basic income for each and every individual in this country, having a more humane policies as far as asylum seekers and refugees are concerned, well then you need to make that step. It doesn't matter how often you click that like button. It doesn't matter how many letters you write. It doesn't matter what fringe political group you vote for at each election. The fact is that if you want major change, if you want social change, if you want to create a better world for your children and your grandchildren, if you don't want to leave them the disasters that we're faced with today, if you want to be able to create a mechanism via which they can actually live a decent life, tackle the issue of climate change, tackle the issue of the corporatisation, tackle the issues of privatisation and outsourcing this caused, tackle the issues of globalisation, tackle corporatisation, well then you need to you need to consider becoming involved. If you don't want to be, that's fine, that's your decision, but don't complain. There's no point complaining if you're doing nothing about change. So I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interests. The details, easy to get to, go to pipsy.net, download the application form, join the group. We've got about 120 new members, and then we can apply for registration as a federal political party and raise new ideas in the political debate in this country. I'm not stupid enough to think we will be elected. It's not a matter of being elected into Parliament, it's a matter of changing the philosophical basis, the ideological background that currently curtails any significant change in this country. Thank you for listening. If you like the if you like the YouTube presentation, tell your friends. If you don't like it, tell your enemies. Maybe they got better taste than you. Once again, my apologies for the wind and the birds and the rooster in the background.